So, good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening again, depending on what time you're listening to this recording, as usual. And welcome to part three of the equilibrium module. And this is going to be a quick one because we'll be talking about government intervention, and we'll only be talking about two main forms of government intervention. There's plenty more. However, that is beyond the scope of your course right now. And to be honest with you, they're very similar to shifts in supply and demand. Okay, so we'll only be talking about two forms of government intervention. And so the picture we have today is New York City in the US, of course. And New York is actually quite a popular example. Cities in general is quite a popular example when discussing government intervention. And I think that it's quite nice for us to just follow in that tradition of using New York as an example when we talk about what happens to market efficiency, what happens to supply and demand and equilibrium when the government intervenes. Okay? And of course, New York, as we know, is quite popular with several things, right? A lot of what you call this? A lot of shows have been based there. We can go as old as Seinfeld or How I Met Your Mother, Friends, or even the show I'm currently watching on Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Amazing cop show. And I think one of the things that we notice when it comes to New York is how cramped the apartments are, right? And there was even one episode in Brooklyn Nine-Nine where Jake tries to rescue his apartment just because of how ridiculously expensive things are in New York. However, as expensive as apartments are in New York, that's actually regulated. Okay, and we're gonna see today what actually happens when this market becomes regulated. Okay, so let's just have a recap on equilibrium, because equilibrium is going to be a very important concept when it comes to government intervention. Okay, so let's remember what equilibrium is. So of course, we have our supply and demand curves, and again, on the x-axis, we've got the quantity of the good. On the y-axis, we've got the price of the good. And there's a supply curve, upward sloping, again, law of supply. The more expensive my good is as a supplier, the more I'd want to sell. And my demand curve is downward sloping over there because law of demand, the more expensive the price of a good is, the less I want to purchase, right? So supply curve and demand curve. And the intersection between the two is what we call the equilibrium, right? And the price of that equilibrium point is called the equilibrium price, and the quantity is called the equilibrium quantity. I hope that's just a recap of what we've already done for the past two lectures. And here is a concept that's really important, right? It's all about market efficiency. When things are at the equilibrium, things are efficient. Everyone is satisfied, not necessarily completely happy, but everyone is satisfied, right? Buyers can buy at the price that they think is fair enough for them, and sellers can sell at the price that they think is, that meets the opportunity cost to sell. And so there is that balance, that equilibrium. So here's just some definitions that we did before, right? So equilibrium price, once again, is a quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. Okay, so this is the price at which the quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. And again, when we have an equilibrium, we neither have a shortage nor a surplus. There is no goods that are not being sold that that just rots away, and also there is no shortage, right, of demand. All demand is met and all supply is met at that price. And equilibrium quantity, as we recalled, is just a quantity at the equilibrium price. And we had this picture before where we likened equilibrium, market equilibrium, right, to some sort of a ball, right? So if the ball is, imagine a ball on a bowl, if the ball is over here, there's a tendency for it to go down, right? And if the ball is over here, there's a tendency for it to go down. Gravity, right? But if the ball is in the middle of the bowl, that is a tongue twister, then it sits happily there. Why? Because it's in equilibrium. Okay, so it's the same concept in economics, where basically if the current price is above the equilibrium price, as we have here, there is a surplus, right? Because the supply that we have here is much greater than the demand. So at the current price, the quantity supplied is much higher than the quantity demanded. So all of these from here to here will not get sold, and we've got a surplus. So what happens? There is a downward pressure on the price in order to remove the surplus. So in the same way as the ball has a tendency to go down when it's not in equilibrium, there's also a tendency for if the current price is above equilibrium, there's a downward push to put the price back to equilibrium. And similarly, on the other hand, if the current price is below the equilibrium price, what happens? There is a shortage because now there is a greater demand than the suppliers are willing to sell, right? So what happens? There's a upwards pressure on price. There's an upwards push to make prices higher in order to cut off the shortage, right? So suppliers, merchants are willing to if people are willing to pay more, right, then what happens is that merchants will be able to sell more goods if they can raise the prices. So there's a upward pressure. So that's what happens. If the price is not an equilibrium, the market forces of supply and demand causes a pressure towards equilibrium. Okay, I hope that's clear. However, just as in the ball example, what happens if suddenly we put some sort of block, let's say over here? What happens there? Obviously, the ball can't move anymore, right? Because you're basically blocking the movement of the ball. Gravity still wants the ball to go down here, but because of this barrier here, it can't do that, right? Because unless this barrier is weak or something like that. But assuming there's like a strong barrier, that ball would not be able to move towards the equilibrium point. And similarly, if we have it on the other side as well, if we put a barrier there as well, we stop the movement. Okay, so what happens then if we put a barrier either up or either down of the equilibrium price? What happens then? Okay, and this is what we call this is an example of government interventions. Okay, so we'll be talking about two types of government interventions. One were basically the two sorts where they put a barrier above and they put a barrier below. We will not be talking about taxes and tariffs and all of that, because that's basically shifting the supply to the left. And we've already done that, okay? And I don't want to get too much into details that you'll be learning further on, okay? So I might put that later on in the example video, but for now, for the main topic of this, we'll only be talking about what happens when the government restricts the price that it cannot go either higher or lower than a certain price. And we'll see that with several case studies. Well, two basically. So, our first case study is rent control. So, why are rent controls in New York such a popular example amongst economists? And it's not just New York, by the way. It's LA, it's Manila, basically any city. I'm not sure if Manila does not have rent controls. LA or some other places in the US with there are rent controls. Why are they such popular examples? When we talk about government intervention, okay? And by the way, the background for this one, if you don't know, that's the precinct for Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Just saying. Anyways, that's from Google Street View. So, why are rent controls in New York such a popular example? Let's have a look. So let's draw a demand and supply curves, right? So on x-axis, we've got the quantity of apartments that's rented out. And the quantity and the price is just as the rent price, right? We're talking about rent prices, not house prices, just rent prices. There's a supply, there's a demand curve, and there's our equilibrium point, right? We've done this many times before. And there's equilibrium price. Now, in New York City, city officials have enacted rent price control. So what does rent price control mean? It means that rent prices cannot go above a certain price. So imagine if this is the rent price control. Okay, this is the rent control price. That means prices cannot go above this point here. However, we know the market is over here. Wait, next. So from what we know about market equilibrium, what do you think happens? Right? So if the current price was over here, there will be an upward push. Right? We know that. Right? Because it's going to be a shortage. If the market price is below, if the price is below the equilibrium price, or the market price as we call it, then there's going to be more demand than supply, and we're going to have a shortage, right? We're going to have a shortage of apartments. Okay, now what happens? There's going to be an upward pressure. We just seen that in the recap. There's going to be an upward pressure. However, here's a problem. Can the prices go higher? Can this upward pressure actually change the cost and prices? No, it can't. Because the government controls the price, right? The government says you cannot go above this price. So you're going to have the shortage, right? Because the market's not going to be happy with that. So basically, you can imagine this orange spot over here as no-go zone. So that means with a rent control price, or what we would call a price ceiling, the price cannot go above the rent control price or the price ceiling, and so we cannot attain the equilibrium price. So what happens? Okay, what happens in New York? It's a very popular example. The reason why it's a very popular example is because of all the chaos that's happening. I remember in one economics textbook that I read, basically what you have in New York is that you'd have so many shortages in housing, but landlords are not willing to rent out their places. Or you can imagine there's a story of like how there's one woman who lives in a huge apartment and she's not willing to move out. Why? Because she wouldn't be able to get another place unless if she moved out. So she's just sticking by with a four bedroom house or something like that, 4-bedroom apartment in New York, and she's the only person living there. Okay, so it just goes haywire. That's why this is such a popular example. It's just because of all the chaos that happens, and sometimes you see landlords, and what happens here when the equilibrium price cannot be met. What happens? Sometimes there's price discrimination. Sometimes a landlord will have to interview tenants, and sometimes if they think they're a bit rich, and then the tenant's like, well, you know what? Because this is the maximum price, we'll pay the maximum price for rent. But to make you happy, how about we do a remodeling of the flat, the apartment? Let's do a renovation of that. And of course, the landlord's going to be happy with that, right? So in a way, there is a control on the rent control price, so people are just gonna try to find a way around that. Okay, so that's what happens, and sometimes, as we're gonna see later, that's how black markets actually happen. It's when there's a price control, either a price ceiling or later on a price floor, and people want to go around that to actually sell for how much it's worth. Okay. And so now let's go for the state study, be corn or whatever other agricultural products. So can the opposite of price ceiling happen? So price ceiling is you can't go above this price. So it's an opposite of that, where you can't go below a price. Yes, there is. It's called a price floor. Okay, so we call these price floors. All right. So a typical example are agricultural products: corn, tomatoes, whatever, cabbages, broccoli, and all of that. So to protect farmers, right, from, let's say, overproduction, to protect farmers when they produce too much, the government sometimes sets price floors. The price of corn cannot go below this price. So let's draw our supply and demand curves. There's equilibrium point again in purple, and there's equilibrium price. Now, if there's a price floor, again, what happens? If this is the current price, we know that there's going to be a surplus, because there's going to be too much supply compared to demand. And when there's a surplus, what happens again? There's a downward push towards the equilibrium. However, because the government said you cannot go below this price, that downward push cannot force the price to go down to equilibrium. That orange spot over there, that's the no-go zone. The government says you can't go below the price floor. So what happens? You've got a surplus, right? So you'd have people selling stuff that you basically have a lot of agricultural products that go to waste, or the government has to make up for that difference. The government has to buy all that surplus stuff, right, in order for things not to get wasted. And sometimes, you might even have some black market stuff where you could sell things on the black market for a lower price because there's a price floor, and then you do it illegally. Okay, so these things can happen because, again, government intervention. So these are the two types of government interventions that we discuss: price floors, price ceilings. Okay, and no two bits. Ceiling price or price ceiling, this is the maximum price that the government says. You cannot go above this price. Floor price, you cannot go below this price. Okay? I hope that's very clear. Ceiling price, like ceiling, right? You can't go above a ceiling. Floor, you can't go below a floor. That's basically what it is. And both make the market inefficient because we cannot go to the equilibrium price sometimes. Okay, let's have a think. So do all price ceilings cause shortages? At first you might think yeah. However, it all depends on where the price ceiling is. So let's go back to our supply and demand curves, right? So what happens if our price ceiling is over here? That means we cannot go above this price. Well, it doesn't matter, does it? Right? Because this is the equilibrium price. So even if the price was here, there's going to be a what's this? A surplus, right? And there's going to be a downward push, right? So at this case, because the price ceiling is above the equilibrium price, the actual price is going to be the equilibrium price. Because we can reach the equilibrium price. The only problem that we have, the only time that a price ceiling will cause a shortage, if the price ceiling prevents us from getting to the equilibrium price. If it prevents the market from getting to the equilibrium price, that's when we have inefficiencies. But if the price ceiling is far above the equilibrium price, no worries. The market will tend to the equilibrium price on its own. The price ceiling is not going to have an effect because that's not where the market wants to go in the first place. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Okay? Next. Same question. Do price floors cause surpluses all the time? Well, we've seen an example already with the price ceiling. And again, if the price floor is below the equilibrium price, that means you can't go below. So this is a no-go zone. Notice the equilibrium price is not part of the no-go zone. So what happens? The market will tend towards the equilibrium price. Remember, the market always tends to go as close to the equilibrium price as possible. And if it's possible for equilibrium price to occur, then the actual price will be the equilibrium price. Okay? Simple as that. Right? So this time the price floor does not make the market inefficient, mainly because we won't reach the price floor anyways. Okay? Or the floor price anyways. Right? So the equilibrium price will be the price that we actually follow, and there will be no inefficiencies in the market. And that's it. That's what we have for government intervention. However, let's just have a think about it, okay? So why do these interventions exist? Why are the rent control prices in New York? Why are the floor prices when it comes to agricultural products and other products? Why? There's a reason why city officials issue rent controls. It's to give more people more opportunities, right? It's to give people who might, because New York, Los Angeles, and all of these cities, they're great places for opportunity. And if you lower the rent prices, then maybe poorer people could come in and get themselves a better life. It makes the market inefficient, yes, but it does give them a better life. Whether or not this is the best way we could approach it is another question altogether. Remember, this course, I am personally here to discuss to you how we can make markets efficient. What makes a market efficient? That's what law and supply tell you. But we will reserve the judgment call as to whether efficient markets are the best for society. And we've said this before. I'm here to tell you this is where equilibrium lies. The equilibrium is where we can get the most efficient markets. Whether or not that's the best for society, it all depends. Think for yourself. Okay? When you're going to go to university, especially if you're doing social sciences, different fields will tell you what is best for society. Okay? If you're a psychologist, if you're a sociologist, things will be different. If you're an economist, things will be different. And even within economics, it depends on what school of thought in economics you're going to follow. So, I'm here to tell you, government interventions, government regulations, they make the market inefficient. As to whether or not that inefficiency is better for society, I will reserve that judgment call. Think for yourself whether or not, and different people will have different answers. Okay? I'm just here to tell you what government interventions are. So that's it for today. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you all on the fourth part of equilibrium. Thank you. And again, here are just some image credits. Thank you.